I think, Mary, you mentioned that you worked a lot on misinformation. At least I
Yep.
think that's what you. And so I'm a science news junkie, not only for science, but also there's a publication called Science News, which is really cool. That I've probably been probably started subscribing back when I was watching Romper Room. So for those of you who've been around with. But anyway, it's a great kind of biweekly magazine that comes out. It's relatively small, but it just has all the very latest science stuff. And they get some great features. And they had two features on misinformation, which I thought were really interesting, especially because as I was reading them, I noticed a few things about it that I'll bring out here. But uh, regarding misinformation, because there is so much out there right now. I think it's important that we think about how we deal with it. One, obviously, we want you to pivot off it whenever you can. The last thing you want to do is give this stuff attention. You don't want to, you know, share on Facebook the latest QAnon theory just to say, look how stupid this is, because all you've done now is put another iteration of the QAnon theory out there into the world. So we don't want to have that happening. But it's going to happen that you may need to directly engage. And that may happen a lot with people you're talking directly to. And so I think it's a good idea to get an understanding of that. And these articles are pretty good. We'll have links to them that we'll send out for you. And I encourage you to read the articles, but I'll kind of go over them. I thought they were really interesting. Here's a quote from one of the two articles. And it's one of the most insidious problems with fake news is how easily it lodges itself in our brains and how hard it is to dislodge it once it's there. We're constantly deluged with information, and our mind uses cognitive shortcuts to figure out what to retain and what to let go. And we've talked about that before. That system one, system two thinking, uh, uh, or the fast and slow thinking. And then sometimes that information is aligned with the values that we hold, which makes us more likely to accept it. That means people continually accept information that aligns with what they already believe, further insulating them in self reinforcing bubbles. Compounding the problem is that people can process the facts of a message properly while misunderstanding its gist because of the influence of their emotions and values. So, anybody who's been with us for a bit recognizes all of that. We've talked about this before, but it is kind of interesting that last part especially, that while people may get the facts right, they don't get what they mean, and that's pretty amazing. Anyway, the article goes on, and from here on, I'm not quoting, but uh, they take a look at what drives misinformation, and basically the people who manufacture it, and they could be here, they could be in Moscow, they could be wherever they're at, Montana, and they're manufacturing this stuff. And then the recipients also drive misinformation because people will repeat it and they'll push it on. Social media has been just, it's like any other technology; it can be used for good or evil. So you have to be, aware of that. Anyway, let's take a look a little bit at some of the things that they pointed to that help misinformation along. They say that polarization, and in our country, it's been it recently has been very intentional. In fact, it's been intentional for almost a half century now on the right. But that polarization was engineered, and we have it, and it's about as deep as it is probably as deep as it's been in this country since the Civil War. And the thing about polarization is it overwhelms critical thinking skills and reasoning. It's just what happens. So that's a interesting to know. There's also the wow factor they talk about in there, which is basically surprising information is more likely to be shared, and we actually sometimes join in on this. In that example I gave you, where oh look here I'm on my Facebook page, and well here's an example of something stupid Trump said or whoever it is. Now we've just made another iteration of it. And so, and we do it so we can laugh at it or debunk it, but we're also promoting it. We're also making it happen again. And so we don't want to be doing that. But notice that this trick of a wow factor, just using surprising information, that can also be used with honesty and integrity. This is what I was noticing about this article. I'm going, all the stuff they're saying about the techniques that at least they brought up in here were things that can be used if you use them with honesty and integrity. So, so we can do that. We can share factual information, and if it's surprising, it's going to get picked up and pushed a little bit more. So, again, don't lie to people. Get out there and be honest and have your integrity intact. But if you can do something surprising, great. That helps your message along. Go for it. There's also, they notice, and this I thought was really interesting, that the particular, I call them vectors, that the information comes through, whether it's text or audio or video, really makes a difference. And it turns out that video sells. Let me get to that. I don't know how easily you can see what's going on here, and it wouldn't matter anyway because I think it's in Taiwanese or Thailandese, whatever is spoken in Thailand. But there was a group of researchers who worked with WhatsApp, and they did some experiments, and WhatsApp users looked at 3 versions of a story that falsely claimed that rice was being made of plastic. So left to right, you have a text, and in the middle you have an audio file, and then on the right you have a video file. And it turns out in their research, they found that people believed the video way more than the others. That video just carries with it a sense of authenticity and truth. And we know that that's not really all true. They also, go to the next one here, that there were other researchers that they said nudging Twitter users to think about the accuracy of a non-political headline resulted in users temporarily sharing more information from more trustworthy media outlets. And so in this chart, what you see, the size of the blue dot is how much was shared. Its position left to right, oddly enough, on the left side, it's the less trustworthy, the InfoWars, the Breitbarts, the people who intentionally develop fake news. And then on the right, the more trusted sources. And they found that people trusted, or that if you give them a nudge to say, think about the accuracy of the information that you're getting, what happened is people started to move to more authentic news sources. I thought that was an interesting finding. So, keep that in mind. Now, both video. Oh, go ahead.
Well, there's a question here, and I think it's apropos to talking about the video. Why do people deny the January 6th insurrection when we all saw the video in real time on TV?
This is an absolute testament to the power of knowing how to manipulate brains. People have been doing this for 10,000 years, if not a million years. We have, we actually pay people to fool us. Have you ever gone and seen a magician, paid to go see, David Copperfield in Vegas or whatever it is? We kind of want it because they know how to fool us. They know the chinks in the brain armor that we have, and so they know where they can do things to mislead us. Well, that power is tremendous, and everybody can fall victim to it.
And Hobie brings up a good point here too, about the separation of misinformation from identity. So I suppose if you have a very strong identification toward Trumpism, then you're going to believe what they say, even though your eyes showed you something completely different.
Yeah, that's another thing's been going on forever. But yeah, the Republicans have been very, very focused on creating an identity for people. So they want people to be proud Republicans, and Republicans now are different than they were just a few years ago. But that's really big, and it's not just being a Republican. They want guys to feel like they're super macho, and they want people to feel that they're very religious, so that you have to be too, and there are a zillion other things. And that stuff really works. It's really dangerous. I mean, we saw it in World War II with Hitler and other fascists, where you just do the right thing. At the very least, make people scared. You can get them to believe just about anything. And so this makes our current situation even scarier. It means we just have to be more on top of our game and know as much as we can. And I know that as liberals, we don't like to go and convince people that they should be, that they need to be exactly like us. We're kind of, our normal way of approaching things is to say, here are all the facts that I've considered, and we lay them out in front of people, and we respect them enough to figure that they are going to look at the same facts, and how could they do anything but come to the same conclusion we have? And it just doesn't work that way. It can. There are people who will look at those facts, and if you nudge people in that direction and you talk about accuracy, it can happen. But it's just not our default way of doing things. It needs help. We were at, I think I got a couple of, yeah, I put a couple slides out of whack here, but this is the video, text, and audio again, and it just shows that video about, and it says investment with the issue, or I'm sorry, involvement with the issue. You can kind of read that in this case as knowledge about the issue, or how much people cared about the issue. And video starts out very, very strong amongst people with the lowest knowledge or lowest involvement with that issue. The video is more persuasive. If there's high involvement, one can assume here that the more knowledge a person has, the less difference there's going to be between video, text, and audio in convincing them, at least. So there's another. So that's a kind of a distillation of some of the things that were in those articles. I highly recommend you go and check them out. Science News does have them behind a paywall, but I think I found that if you search it the right way, they come up. So those are the links I gave you, and hopefully they'll work for you. They've been working for me. Also want to talk about something different. And we talk so much about frames and using values in our frames, and should I stop and maybe ask, are there any questions about what I just talked about before I move on?
I think there's a lot of interesting comments in the chat about the use of video and referencing George Floyd, which was my personal opinion was very powerful, and probably was the reason why Derek Chauvin was convicted, and why that became such a strong thing, because people saw that video. And so it's interesting. But then so that worked that way, but then with the January 6th insurrection, we all saw this, but people are, certain members of Congress are being, trying to be very successful at getting people to not believe what they saw on the video. And so it's kind of confusing how, you can hold both of those things.
Let me do quick comments on some of the other things I see in here, because our chats are usually great. Linda mentioned that it makes sense that video would be more powerful as it involves more senses. Yeah, that's we've talked about that before too. The more senses that you can put into your messages, the better, and the more sensory information, because it's the kind of thing people remember. And if you're doing that, you're probably also telling a story, because it's kind of hard to get a lot of sensory information if you're quoting numbers and facts and so forth. So, but the more senses, the more vivid you can paint that picture in someone's mind, the more likely it's going to be to be remembered. Demi mentioned that in 2012 we still had a strong rural identity, a democratic identity, but that's changed, and it has been repetition by Fox News, and it's been intentional engineering by Republicans to make that work. Then, let's see, we had, and we're hardwired to trust, as Phil says. That is true. And so that's kind of our default position. We'll kind of trust people who we see, because we don't want to not trust them, or we don't want to confront them. And all right, so we kind of went through those. All right, so any other questions on that? Okay, we will move on. Here's something this is something that I have been working on, so the graphics aren't great because it's mostly an idea document, but I wanted to bring this up, and I'm going to put off the part that we were going to talk about how the Republicans basically hoisted themselves on their own petard and got to this position, because I thought this was kind of important. We have a lot of talking to do right now about voting and some very important issues, and I think there are some distinctions in this about framing that I think will help just to kind of clear things up. So we talk a lot about value frames and making sure that we make our messages around the values that liberals hold. And but I haven't talked a lot about explanatory frames. I just wanted to bring them up again. I mean, a frame is a way of thinking about something. It's a story. It's a metaphor. There and sometimes you just need to make a complex concept clearer. And so sometimes your frames may not have values in them, but they're still very useful because if you pick the right one, you can help someone along to understand something better. And so it gives people a way to understand something new in terms of something they already know. That's why metaphor is so important. And the example we've used before is internet as superhighway. So if people understand how a highway works, if they drive, they get it. So you can go ahead and map what the features of the internet onto the features of a highway, and that helps people understand how that works. And then and it's a real shortcut to being able to understand something more complex. And because we focus so much on value frames, I didn't want to give explanatory frames short shrift. I think it's important that we're always looking for ways to make our ideas clearer. And if that takes a metaphor to do, or takes us just trying to get an explanation across, go ahead and do that. You can come back to your values, but it's just fine to do this. Value frames, what's really helpful for them is rather than giving them an example or a map to go by, it's a different lens to understand an issue. It's kind of the same thing, but the lens is a moral one. We're trying to talk about right and wrong in our issues. So that's why value frames are important. And then by evoking our underlying value frames, we strengthen those frames in people's minds. I told you this is a working document, so I got to get my tense right here. But but that's why we're doing this, right? And then once you learn to do it, it gets easier to fashion really effective messages on the fly. The more practice you get at it, the better you get at, the more the ideas these come up, the more you notice it in the news and when people do it right or they do it wrong. So this particular slide, what I want to show here is that one issue can use a lot of different frames. And there's this feeling that when we talk about framing or messaging, that people believe that the holy grail of framing and messaging is to create a bumper sticker. We got to find the perfect bumper sticker. It's got to be 6 words long, and it's got to just absolutely be so effective that it's just going to instantly change people's minds. I mean, that's great if you come up with that. More power to you. But I think we're missing something if that's the way we think. So, for example, on healthcare, we can make a message from a protection frame. And so Medicare for all, for example, means peace of mind or healthcare made easy. And the peace of mind is a protection frame. I threw healthcare in there, healthcare made easy in there because I like that frame, because everything's hard about it. But the protection, really, we want to make sure that we're healthy and we should be protected. So that's part of our message. Empowerment. And I'm shorthanding the M4A here, Medicare for All, keeps you healthy no matter what. We empower citizens to be healthy, and we have every right to do that. As citizens, we can just say, like every other modern democracy has, everybody gets covered. We can have an investment frame that M4A prepares children for life, and or fairness, everyone in, no one out. So consider that. That is one issue using a number of different frames. And they'll change maybe depending on the person you're talking to or the situation or the particular aspect of healthcare you're talking to. So be aware you can use more of those values on that issue. Also, same for education. I won't read all of these, but the same frames, protection, empowerment, investment, and fairness, can all be used in our messages about education. So you can probably guess what the next slide is. Instead of the issue, I've put the frame up on top, and notice that you can then see that you have healthcare, education, which we just saw, but you can also talk about protection and infrastructure. Bridges are crumbling, that's no good, or protection and environment. So what happens is every time we use our somewhat limited set of values, and there will always be less values than there are issues. If we get these values down and start applying them across issues, we're not only making our message for that issue more powerful, we're also reinforcing the underlying value for all the other issues. So if we talk about protection for healthcare and education and infrastructure and environment and about gun safety and about every other issue, those our core values, liberal core values, are being built up in people's brains as a way to see things. It's strategic. It's not going to happen like in 10 minutes. It's not going to happen one election cycle. But we have to be doing this all the time. We should have been doing this. If we had, we might not be quite in the pickle we are today. But that's a very important thing about frames, is that we need to think about our values and apply them across all the issues so that we not only bolster our messages on the issues, we bolster those underlying frames. Now, be careful when you're doing this that you don't light up the wrong frame. So, for example, the first one's a little tricky. So if we say gun control, the control part of that is going to immediately trigger in somebody who's leaning right. It's going to trigger thoughts of the Second Amendment. It's going to trigger the very popular taking frame that is used a lot: taking guns, taking land, you're taking money from me, all that. And big government, control and big government go together. So we have to be careful about that. Also, control brings up protection. Now, for us, the protection is we want to protect people from getting shot. We want common sense gun safety. But also also figure that for conservatives, and I don't know if you can see the line, it should be purple, or protection is purple, because the conservatives also believe in protection, but in this case, the protection frame applies to somebody walking into their house or somebody on the street that they feel threatened by. So protection is a contested frame, and we've talked about that before, and we'll bring it up, but it's one where it's used on both sides. So even if we think we know what we're talking about, we have to be careful that we don't light up frames that are strong on the right, or we won't get through to them. So that's just a caution. And don't use a conservative frame. We sometimes like to think that if we use a conservative frame to convince a conservative that they're wrong, that we're helping in any way. And in this case, we went through the gun control part of it. And so the gun control, just as an aside, big government and taking and nanny state kind of things pop up. But there's also the protection frame comes out of control, as we just talked about. For us, the protection frame then leads to children and family. But let's follow this through the brain cells of somebody on the right. Pro-life, well, they see a protection frame, and for them, that protection frame leads to, they want to protect fetuses, so that leads to abortion, which leads to religion, which leads to the prohibition against murder, which is a sin. So now these are, just think of these as actual physical brain cells lining up in order, just flashing them and connecting to more and more. So you can see that those structures in people's brains that are already there can be triggered. Rather complex structures can be triggered sometimes by a single word. And then notice also that in their frame of abortion, that is protection of children. It also leads to family. So it's kind of interesting. We go to the same place, but because our message is muddled, it's combined. We've combined two of them, and we've chosen to use the words pro-life. Then what we've done is we've just re-energized and strengthened all of those ideas in people's heads who don't already agree with us. Does that make sense? Any questions on that so far? Okay. So kind of as a recap, every issue can use virtually all of the same frames. And by evoking our underlying frames across all the issues, we strengthen those frames in people's minds. That's what we all need to do over time. And strategically, we can do what the Republicans did, because that's exactly what they did for 50 years now. And again, the number of frames will always be smaller than the number of issues. I only point that out because to say that it's easier to remember the values. It's also easier to have a moral conversation, both for you and for the voter. So you're not going to be caught not knowing your facts, not knowing the numbers, and or even not knowing anything about the issue. If you can bring it to a moral question of right and wrong, everybody can have that conversation. Everybody feels a little safer and more comfortable having a conversation. So I'll stop for a second. And are there any comments, questions about that? I'm looking here. We've got. Oh, it looks like Mary left. Bye, Mary. Sorry. And then Hobie mentioned. Hobie is also quite the expert framer. He said, explanatory frame on climate. We are sitting in our car in our garage with the motor running and the garage door shut. There's a metaphor for you. That's the way to go. That is a good one. So, okay.
I'm wondering, well, there was, Demi said, oh, this is when we're still talking about the video, but that the January 6th insurrection was initially accepted, the visual influence, but GOP echo chambers have been relentless in reframing the insurrectionists into patriots. So then maybe that
Or
kind
tourists.
of, yeah. So and so I don't know if that connects with what you were just talking about, like.
In that, what they've done is another topic for tonight, which is they've pivoted in a way. They're distracting, which is often what, if you talk to them about the insurrection, they pivot and they call it a patriotic group, or they minimize it by saying patriotic protest, or they minimize it by saying that they're rioters or even just a mob, and. This idea of pivoting, again, another idea that also works for us, because while they're pivoting to distract from the reality, we can pivot from misinformation back to reality, and that's what we should be doing. Get people off. Don't argue with these people about their reality, their issue. It's not real. Spend time talking about our stuff, and that'll that at least cuts down the amount of times people hear about that. But it also shows people that, hey, there's another way to think about it. How many of us have gotten involved talking to someone who has a wacky idea, and we spend 10, 15 minutes debunking them, and somebody goes, oh, the pizza's here. And so we never got around to our message. We got to do that first. We got to talk about what the reality is and the truth is first. And in fact, that leads us to another way to fight misinformation. One is called, and this one I thought was really interesting. You've heard me say a number of times that what you want to drop doing in our stop, drop, and roll is you want to drop debunking, because not that you can never do it, but that you don't want to make that your main message. You don't want to come out with that because the pizza might arrive, or because when you're doing it, you're in your opponent's frame, so you're bolstering their frame, and whether it's a value frame or an explanatory one, and you're also repeating their message. And repetition is crazy. The more you repeat something, more people believe it, and it's called the illusory truth effect. And it turns out that even when people know a statement is false, hearing it again and again gives it more weight. Again, a trick of how to make brains work the way you want them to work. Now, that's being used in a non-truthful way, but again, repetition can be used to repeat the truth, and we get the same effect. Again, I was just kind of interested to find that the things that these articles were calling tricks are actually also can be used with honesty and integrity. So, but here's a different kind of, instead of debunking, the Scientific American's articles talked about prebunking, which I thought was really interesting. It's true information. I'll read this that they had that true information presented after misinformation doesn't help. Information, which is basically debunking. Okay, there's bad information. I'm going to debunk it by giving you some true information. In effect, the damage has already been done. The brain cells have been lit up, and now you're trying to call them back. The horse is out of the barn. The brain cells are lit up, whatever. But true information presented before misinformation does, as long as you don't repeat the bad information. Obviously, that's difficult. You have to anticipate what your opponent is going to say before they say it. And do that in the moment if you happen to be talking with that person. That can be difficult, but it's something to be thinking about. It is something that can work, and it can be used in a strategic sense in that if we basically give the truth about something often enough, we see this a lot in the environment because there's so much information going on around that if we just keep presenting the true information, especially if that information specifically kind of debunks a message we've heard before from our opponents, then if we're out there prebunking, we're getting we're able to put in good information in people's brains, and also getting people to think about the accuracy of what they're reading. That kind of goes along with prebunking, but also just in general, if you remind people to think about the accuracy of the information they're getting just for a moment, a lot of times they may stop and think about it. A quick fact check can be super helpful in pointing out something that they may never have thought of before. And some of you may have run across this. I've talked about it before, that when I've been able to get out and just get people to stop for a minute and think, I mean, we use stop to get ourselves to stop and think about messaging, but if we also get the people we're talking to stop for a moment, to take a look at the issues, and you give them this other way of thinking about it, it's not uncommon to hear from them, I never thought of it that way before. I mean, I've been surprised how many times that's happened. I've used the example. I had some client of mine a while back in my old business, and he and one of his crew were talking about homelessness and why don't those people just go get jobs and what's wrong with them. We shouldn't give them any money. It just encourages them to not work and all that stuff. And so I just walked up and figured, okay, I'm not going to win these guys over, but I may as well throw a monkey wrench into their thinking. And I just said, so what do we do with those people? And I just shut up. That's the old salesman's trick. So are you going to buy this from me? And then you don't say another word. The first person that speaks loses. And I think it works this way too. It goes through their heads and they start thinking, well, gee, I never thought of that. Hey, that's a step. You may not have the win today, but you put a bug in somebody's head. You planted a seed that says, maybe I can think about this differently. You're kind of forcing them to do it. So think about that and see. And then also, you can also, if you're very much into logical fallacies, which are studied very greatly by lawyers and others, but if you know a particular logical fallacy that people are using, or even a propaganda trick, such as cherry picking information, or leaving out information and other such things. Sometimes if you're having a good discussion, not a fighting discussion, that you might happen to mention, well, that's interesting because what I see there is that they're cherry picking information. That blows their logic all to heck. So something to think about there. And we did mention the pivot, and as any of you might have read one of Al Franken's books, he mentions the pivot and how difficult it was for him. He found out about the pivot the hard way. He'd gotten to Washington. He'd already been speaking in the Senate, and somebody asked him a question about something, and he answered it, and his staff is just going, oh no, he's answering a question. And so they get back to the Senate office, and the Al says all of his staffers are looking at him like he really did something bad. And so we asked him, what's going on? Well, you answered the question that so-and-so asked you. He goes, I'm not supposed to do that? And they go, no, you're not. You're supposed to pivot. They asked you that question in order to get you. They asked you a question a certain way to put you on the spot and get you to stay in their frame to discuss this. So you need to learn how to pivot. And so he figured out that this is all about knowing before you go into something, what do you want to say and what do you not want to say. And if you know what you don't want to say, when you hear it and somebody pushes it on you and tries to make you speak within that their frame, you just know to pivot out of it. And this is something that takes practice. I'm thinking when we get back into doing in-person workshops, I think we might want to do a role-playing exercise with that. As much as I'm not, I find role-playing exercises to be make me nervous. They still they can be very helpful. So anyway, I've thrown a lot at you. I do want to keep the conversation up. Any questions? Any comments on any of this?
Well, Mark asked a question. It's around race, and the question is, how could we successfully frame systemic institutionalized racism to convince people who don't believe it exists that it does exist? Which values could be used, for instance? And then Hobie mentioned the race class narrative, which I put a link to that in the chat. And maybe Hobie, in a second, could explain the race class narrative for those, including myself, who don't know that much about it. But I will say, just speaking from my own perspective as a white woman who has done a ton of this work in the last 15 years of my career as a school district administrator, especially the last 5 years in St. Louis Park. And that is a tough one, because to convince white people that there's systemic racism, it really requires a lot of really the white person to like really get over their fragility and just really start digging deep into themselves, and and certainly white people can and are doing that, but not probably at the rate that is necessary to solve this problem in the United States. And I just know for myself, I've had to really dig deep over the years to even understand what it means to be white in this country, because it's just the air we breathe. And but Hobie, if you don't mind, because I think you do know a little bit about the race class narrative, if you wouldn't mind just talking about what that is.
Sure. Thanks, Lisa. I might start by saying perhaps that's the wrong question. How do we convince somebody that there's systemic racism? Because as soon as I use that word convince, it puts me in the mode of trying to reason with you and prove to you that something exists so that you will then understand it and change. But that's a little different than what George has been talking about. So the race class narrative is something that was developed by Anat Shankar-Osorio and the Voting Rights Lab and a lot of other organizations. And it was put together to combat some of the elements of dog whistling that we hear out there, which are, if you look at the right, we're creating racial fear, we're creating economic resentment, we're creating disgust with government. And perhaps the way to bridge that is to talk about stories and metaphors that show cross-racial solidarity and shared prosperity for racial justice, and government that's functional and competent, and that actually works. And the way we do that is by starting our stories by saying, regardless of the color of our skin, where we come from, or where we live, we believe in, and then insert your core value. We believe in everybody should have an equal opportunity to succeed. And then we identify how that value is being violated. For too long, there have been too many rich people doing X, Y, or Z, or bankers, whatever, in the process. and then come back to creating a vision where we believe that we should all have opportunities to succeed for our families, and then call to action, whatever you want to construct around that. But it's sort of leading with this solidarity, to start with, and then show with a value and solidarity, and then showing how that value is violated, and then coming back with our vision of what America would be like, and then asking people to take action based on that. And you tell a short story in this process of doing that. So that's the Cliff's Notes version. But take a look at the the links there. It's been, that process has been used, well, for those of you in Minnesota, remember the marriage amendment. The marriage amendment was a really great example of how that was used. We didn't talk about all the reasons why we should, the marriage amendment, or things weren't fair and that sort of thing. We talked about how we all had members of our family that we loved that were different from us, but that they deserved to be able to love the people that they loved. And so the underlying value there was love. And it's pretty hard to fight that underlying value in the process. So I just encourage that, because it's a frame by itself. Kind of, we think of it as a hashtag for, these are the magic words if I just say these 3 words. But a frame only exists, as George says, when you build a story around it. And this, to me, is the next level of story. If that makes sense.
And Mark, I share the frustration. One of the this is something like George Lakoff talks about too. That on the left, we think about systemic causation, like people coming across the border. To conservatives, they're illegal, they're criminals, and we think of it, well, what causes someone to come here, and then you start looking into all the systems, and the problem is that on the right, there a lot of the messaging is specifically aimed at having people not make decisions using or thinking about the systemic causes of things. You think of direct causes. People are coming across the border. Well, build a wall so they can't get across. And so it's difficult. And I mean, this is going to happen. I mean, people are going to. This needs to be dealt with. It's something this country has dealt with for 400 years. We've fought a war over it, and it doesn't ever seem to get solved. But I think if we're using our values enough, I think the values might, and this is just a supposition on my part, that if we keep talking about our values, I think love is a very important one. It certainly was for LGBTQ plus, and in Minnesota, and very powerful. And fairness is another one. Investment, everybody has worth and dignity in this country, and everywhere. So, and it makes sense for us to make sure that everyone is doing as well as they can. But if we use our values, I think people will start to think of it differently. That might open up and allow people to actually see the systemic problems. I think, unfortunately, because by the time it gets to the police, they're at a car, it's already too late. There has to be and I think what they're doing with the reimagining of policing now, there are some great ideas coming out of that. There's not great messaging so far. On a different webinar, from somebody else, Antonia Scatton, who was a guest here, but on one of her webinars, somebody asked her the question after she mentioned that defund the police was a framing disaster, and in a way, it really is a framing disaster, but in another way, it's not. And this is where it gets tricky. So, defund the police is kind of I didn't even know about Saul Alinsky until the conservatives brought him up, right? And so I went back and looked at this guy, Saul Alinsky, and he said he's of the poke him in the eye school of messaging. Make it tough on everybody. Get them upset. Because if you do, your issue gets talked about. And so defund the police, where where it is not a great message overall for liberals, it did succeed. If your only goal was to get people to talk about policing, it worked. And now, at what cost? And it's a very dangerous thing to just pick things like that can really get people upset, or even worse, cause other parts of the movement. Like, for example, if defunding the police costs Democrats the House and the Senate and the presidency in 2022, then we haven't accomplished anything. We've actually moved backwards. So, I wish I could give you a really clear answer. I think what Hobie was saying and what I've been saying about just keep talking about those values, grounded in those values, and get people to think about it. Just throw those ideas at people. How do we love one another? Drop that out there. See what happens.
Thank you.
It is a great question. As somebody else said, oh, do a great question, Mark. It is. That is a great one. Okay. It's 8:00. Okay. I have two more things real quick just to go out with for fun here. One is a don't think of an elephant moment, which was shared by Federico, who is not on tonight's thing, but Federico shared this with us. I'm going to make this a little bigger, maybe. Oh, that didn't help at all. This says, this is a meme. I did not divide the country. The Republican decision to obstruct every single thing I proposed to help us dig out of the financial crisis they caused divided the country. What comes out of that? Obama divided the country. That message was repeated. Obviously, this is Republican projection, because their goal has been to divide this country and polarize people, because polarizing gets people to stop using reason. And here we just did it. Federico says, if I can read that, this is a counterproductive meme. It hurts Obama and the Dems because it leads with a negative, I did not do. Our brains are conditioned to think he did it. This meme seems to be designed by a Republican or a Russian, which he's probably right. But that, this is the don't think of an elephant that Lakoff talks about. He told you don't think of an elephant, and you're all thinking of elephants right now. That's how the brain works. Or one of my favorites, Nixon, I am not a crook. So there's that. All right, and then I've got, just for fun, a moment of Zen. Notice the messaging around us. Calm our anger. Think clearly. Think before we speak. Unlearn ineffective messaging. Say why you care. I know it's goofy, but I just want people to think about those things. We're having a little fun. Why not? So anyway, that's it for us. We'll stick around a little bit if people want to talk. Stick around 15 minutes or so and talk. But I again really appreciate everybody here, and I would encourage you all, if you have examples of good messaging or bad messaging, or something that you've done that's pretty effective regarding messaging wherever you are, let us know. Email us. Let us know. I think it's important, again, to build community. I think if we're talking to each other in these webinars and we share these things, we're learning from each other and we're seeing how it works. We're also convinced that we're not alone. So thanks, everyone.
So you don't need any more ineffective messaging examples?
No more ineffective messaging, no.
Okay. Just-
I actually had some goofy meditation music playing with that, but it didn't come across. So, oh well.
That's so goofy.
I know, I'm a weird guy.
Very interesting, George and Lisa, and everybody. Thank you very much. I took lots of notes.
Great.
Good. And and it's these are always so enhanced by everybody here that puts things in the chat, and the discussions that we have is always enhanced. What what George puts together, the curriculum, I
Well,
guess.
and so many good ideas. I mean, there's so many brilliant people that I've met. I've heard from, well, Linda had, I forget, what were we talking about? You had just some great things a few webinars ago that just added so much to what we were doing. And it's so cool. I mean, we're all in this together. We need to share, we need to practice together. We need to correct each other and be okay with that. But this is how we build, and I'm just so happy that we have people from around the country now joining us. So
Yeah, thank
Hey,
you.
George.
I use my mediation background
yeah, that was
when it comes to framing and messaging.
yeah, and that was so cool. You were talking about that and how that works.
Yeah, so this was great. Always learn more. I enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank
You
you.
got it. Send me something. We'll feature you on one of these. That would be cool.
And you're going to send out the link to the recording, right? Because I missed the first 25 minutes.
Yes.